I'm Carole Goble. I'm talking about fair computational workflows, and I'm particularly representing the EU European division of this activity. Next slide. Okay, so what are the FAIR workflows, FAIR computational workflows? Well, this is kind of coming from the FAIR data principles, which mean findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. I've put a handy link there in case you haven't read the paper, and the next slide reminds you all what the FAIR principles are. But in a nutshell, they're to do with machine processable metadata. It's developed an entire industry of criteria, metrics, services, compliance, and goodness knows what else around the concept of FAIR data. But what about FAIR principles for software or FAIR principles for computational workflows in particular? In two kind of ways. FAIR workflows as fair digital objects in their own right, which has interesting duality. In some senses, they can be used as viewed as fixed sort of data objects, but they're also living software objects. And also the role of workflows in actually producing fair compliant data. So as users and producers of fair data and as of fair services. And there's been a huge flurry of fair computational workflow activity in recent months, in the last sort of 18 months, workshops, papers, policy statements, metadata standards, infrastructure. And on the right, I've got a handy collection of logos of various different activities. For example, Workflow Hub, which is the European registry for workflows, Workflow RO Crate, which is our way of being able to package workflows so that they are fair, various different standards, different conferences and so on. And I've also put in Wholetail for Bertram in this direction. And we've even written a paper about it. Next slide. So this is the handy cut out and keep what FAIR principles are for data in a nutshell. I won't go into the details. If you join the group, this will be a handy thing for you to look at, but it's to do with persistent identifiers, authentication authorization, availability of protocols, provenance, standards for licensing, etc. And provenance, of course. Next slide. So what are the challenges? Well, I've got some detail here, which I'm not going to go into. It's there in order to stimulate conversation when we do the breakout. So the big questions are, what are the FAIR principles for computational workflow objects, in the sense that they are processual things with lots of dependencies and different kinds of granularities. In particular, they're living objects with composite structure. So you kind of end up with a recursive FAIR all the way down notion of them. How do we design for and support reuse? Because one of the prime things is to have reusable workflows that you can then find, they can interoperate, and then we can reuse them. And not just portability, but kind of libraries of so-called canonical workflows that are trusted and safe to reuse. And are there real reuse use cases for that? And also, how do we all work together? Because there's a slew of activity in this on standardized metadata, on shared infrastructures, and also making sure that this is all developer friendly rather than theoretically beautiful. And I point out, for example, the Research Data Alliance has the FAIR for Research Software working group, which Dan Katz is very heavily involved in, which is also related to this kind of activity. In fact, there's a little subsection of it to do with fair computational workflows, which really has been underdeveloped and we could do something about. Next slide. So some of the challenges also around FAIR-centric data processing. So here, the previous slide was about workflows as FAIR objects in their own right. What about the verification of workflows that paves the way for trustable data that can be exploited by third parties? That is, operating as a FAIR service within an ecosystem of other services. And here we've got things like not using proprietary formats. How do we mint and manage identifiers? How do we respect data licenses? What do we mean about tracking provenance? How do we honor credit traces? What about black box handling and managing data visiting? Because this is all to do with workflows operating in a FAIR data ecosystem. So producing and using FAIR data. For all the different kinds of workflow phenotypes, that means things like human in the loop workflows, pipelines, BPM style workflows, job scheduling type workflows, application chaining type of workflows, workflows, and so on. So are there different kind of requirements for workflow-centric fair data processing? And do these kinds of workflows have different properties if we were identifying criteria for fair workflows? So that's what we're going to discuss. Lots of fair.